This one is related to the data flows for integration with OpenAir. Specifically, I'm going to talk about 3 different system integrations that we typically run into at TopStep when we're dealing with customers and their OpenAir environments. And those are namely the QuickBooks integration, both standard and online, Concur integration, and the NetSuite integration. Talking a little bit about at high level about how those are typically approached and some of the gotchas or watch out fors. And of course, certainly if you have questions or you want to follow up with a more detailed conversation, would love to hear from you guys. But before we get going, as I normally do, let me just tell you what's going on here at TopStep. So we've got some exciting news in the month of June. Next week we will be doing the Denver OpenAir User Group. Our friends over at Synchronous will be hosting it. We're doing a brunch style this time just to kind of give that a go for something different. So it's June 16th. But I have to say selfishly what's very exciting is on Sunday, TopStep will officially be 10 years old. This is our anniversary year. We're trying to do a lot of give back. So if you get our newsletters, certainly scroll down to the bottom. We're trying to figure out every month to give something back like an ebook or discount on consulting or charity contribution. So I just want to thank everyone who's been with us this year and in past years for all the support as we continue forward in our journey. And finally, just a reminder, in April we launched a new part of our website called the Extension Marketplace. This is, we've been working with a lot of our customers, a lot of you, on building scripting solutions to sort of plug those gaps of functionality that you wish OpenAir could do or wish OpenAir could do in a more automated sense. But we've been able to deliver those for you. And in some cases, many of those are things that multiple customers could benefit from. So we have come up with some of them on our own of things that we know would really benefit the product. And we've put them out on our marketplace called Extension Marketplace. If you go to our website, you'll see a little button in the upper right-hand corner about the marketplace and all the current extensions we have out there. We're trying to add some every couple of weeks, so you can always check and see what's the newest, latest, and greatest. Okay. So now let's get on to the actual topic of what you dialed in for. Enough about us. We're talking about integration approaches with OpenAir and really going to focus on these 3 systems. So I get a lot of questions about integrations and what OpenAir can talk to. OpenAir doesn't really reach out and talk to anything except for NetSuite, I guess, natively because of the NetSuite OpenAir relationship and the integrations investment that NetSuite has put into the product. But OpenAir is typically integrated with a lot of different types of systems because in the world of professional services, you tend to have to touch a lot of different parts of the company. Things like what's coming in from sales, so we're talking to the sales systems, accounting systems like a NetSuite, like SAP, even expense systems like Concur. So even though OpenAir has an expense module, Concur tends to be a system because it's so specialized in the functionality it can deal with as far as talking to vendors. Customers will prefer to use Concur, and then they would want to integrate that into OpenAir so it can handle like the pro forma invoicing, rebilling. Then there's other things like HR systems. You know, when people come on board, you have to set them up in 17 different systems. When they come on board, can you just automate that so you build an integration? And then other things like payroll. So OpenAir actually does have a lot of these integrations typically built, but how are they usually built? And they're built in like 3 different ways today. One way that some of you may be familiar with is a tool, I think it's called OpenAir Connect now, or Services Connect, but it's underlying, its original name was Integration Manager. This is an executable that you can purchase from NetSuite that allows you to talk to OpenAir's database in a structured manner. I've got another slide that talks a little bit more about it. But it really deals with files, flat file exports and imports into OpenAir. The second way, which is actually something that's come along over the past 3 or 4 years quite a bit, is third-party vendors. So Dell Boomi, one of the first ones on the scenes to build an integration tool that could connect to OpenAir. Soligo is now coming out with their version of the same thing. Jitterbit has a solution. So a lot of the integration tool vendors out there are building product connectors or ways to connect with standard solutions to the OpenAir environment, which then opens up a lot of opportunity to integrate OpenAir with other systems. And then finally, the OpenAir APIs themselves. This is where your IT departments can go crazy and build all kinds of nice queries against the OpenAir database, just calling and building your own integration from scratch, so to speak. But in each one of these cases, it's not so much about the technology, it's more about the why do you need to do an integration and what to watch out for. So make sure that if you're connecting systems together, just because you connect them doesn't mean you're passing the right data or it's going the right direction. So make sure you consider who owns the data, who's entering the data, what system owns the data, any dependencies that are in place, how much of a cost is it going to be to build the integration versus the inconvenience of putting the data in, for example. An integration that costs $100,000 for someone to have to uncheck a box manually once a week may not be the best return on investment. But of course, integrations, quite honestly, are usually a time saver, a cost saver, which is why they're so attractive. So the Integration Manager product, if you're not familiar with this, this is something you can download and connect to the OpenAir database. It doesn't give you exposure of the database itself, but it allows you to essentially use a flat file mapping of database fields from the tables to a CSV extract, or from a CSV extract into OpenAir mapping to certain key fields. It handles some basic field overrides, translating the letter A to the number 1 if you want to change an A meaning active to 1 meaning active in OpenAir. It does have some accounting roll-up capabilities in it that allows you to create offsetting journal entry transactions if you needed to integrate with a financial system. And it has some real basic error logic, like you can't load a date with a bad format. But it does allow it really has limited error checking as you put in. So one of the cautions as customers get Integration Manager from NetSuite that we give and that NetSuite gives to customers is make sure you get training before you start using it because it does talk natively to the database. We want to make sure it's set up to talk correctly. Because it does a file mapping, it has the ability to basically save the map into something called a shortcut, and that becomes a standalone executable that can be scheduled. So Integration Manager is quite often used to build batch integrations. It's something you can do configuration, save the executable, schedule it to run, and now you've got a batch integration with a fairly low cost. The third-party vendors out there, they typically have a connector solution or an official connector to OpenAir. When you talk with them, definitely ask them about how they've implemented that solution, how you can get a copy of that solution to use it. They're mostly a subscription-based offering at this point in time, so you're paying for another licensing of another system essentially to use their tool. But it is in the cloud because OpenAir is in the cloud, so oftentimes it's in the cloud. But the benefit of a vendor tool is it does have potentially more capabilities as far as data translation and transformation, error checking built in because it's a tool specifically to do integration and not necessarily just a file transfer activity. And then finally the API. So this is sort of the sky's the limit. You get access directly to the database, but of course you're writing the code to actually handle everything. So you're doing the connection, you're doing the retry logic, you're doing the error handling, you're doing the table lookups. So this is a code investment. Like you have to write the code to do this. And there's SOAP and XML APIs. So it does provide a much higher level of flexibility. You're not boxed in by a vendor solution or by what the limited capabilities of Integration Manager. But because it's so flexible, you also have to have your developers learn more about the OpenAir database and understand what fields to set, how to pull and interact with OpenAir, the system. So they do have to learn more about the system than they normally would if they would use a vendor solution. Okay. The only caution I have on APIs is that for many systems that allow you to connect to an API, they also allow you to have some kind of event or a trigger occur when you talk to a system. And OpenAir does not currently have a triggering system, so you tend to have to write a polling interface, which also requires some scheduling and timing in order to get timely data transfers. So let's talk about the QuickBooks desktop standard integration with Integration Manager. I worked with many of you on the phone perhaps in this integration, or you're thinking about doing this integration. Just some things to level set what it allows you to do. It's a very, very simple integration, and it's above all a pre-built integration. The pre-built integration talks to QuickBooks in a specific way and in OpenAir a very specific way. The data flows allow you to pass invoice data from OpenAir into QuickBooks and payment information backwards into OpenAir. And it allows you to pass expense data from OpenAir into QuickBooks and pass reimbursement information from QuickBooks back into OpenAir. And that's all the standard integration does. It doesn't deal with revenue. It doesn't deal with time. It's really a basic AR/AP integration, but it's a very simple one, which means it's a very low cost to implement because everything's pre-configured. Okay. The QuickBooks integration tool itself, it is actually part of Integration Manager. So the Integration Manager tool is set up. It logs into both OpenAir and to QuickBooks to be able to do its discussion back and forth. So that's essentially what the integration supports. Now the tips and controls regarding the standard integration is something to be aware of is when OpenAir is connected with QuickBooks, OpenAir becomes the master. So if you have a new client that you want to set up in QuickBooks, you have to put them in OpenAir and let OpenAir pass that over to QuickBooks. If you have a new project, you set that up in OpenAir and that passes over to QuickBooks as a job against that client or that account. If you have a new user, you set them up in OpenAir and it passes over and enters them into the vendor table. So OpenAir does become the master for all of this, so it becomes instead of QuickBooks telling OpenAir, OpenAir tells QuickBooks. The account mapping is very simple. It's often a one-to-one. It does not have to be a one-to-one from an account perspective. And when I mean account, I mean like revenue, professional services revenue, consulting revenue, travel expense, airfare, lodging. You can have a many-to-one relationship in OpenAir to QuickBooks so that more granular tracking happens in OpenAir and then maps over to a singular entry in QuickBooks. But the logic within the standard integration, there is no logic that you can add. You have a few checkbox options on whether you pass payments backwards or forward, whether you roll up charge items by type or not for invoicing, whether you use classes or not. It's very much a checkbox, and I think there's a total of maybe 15 of those checkboxes, and that's it. So you can't add any code or logic to say, oh, by the way, if the expense item is XYZ and it's a client project, then I want this airfare to post to this reimbursable account versus this other airfare, which is internal cost. It doesn't have any of those smarts in it. So you do end up having to consider a custom integration if you have to add logic for the mapping to be more automated between the two systems, and it's not very simple. Okay. The one thing to be aware of is sometimes OpenAir has more data than QuickBooks would care about. So if you're passing potentially like proposal type stuff into OpenAir from your CRM, that stuff may not necessarily be desired in QuickBooks because it's not a signed order, not an official client yet. So you can use a filter set on the user record that is logging in with the QuickBooks integration to prevent the integration from seeing certain clients, certain projects if you'd like. And then just a note, if you do have QuickBooks Online, back in the day there used to be an standard integration available for online. That's actually no longer available, so if you do have QuickBooks Online, you do end up having to look more at a third-party vendor or the Integration Manager shortcut approach, the file exchange approach, which would use like a Transaction Pro tool, for example, which is a very low-cost purchase to talk to QuickBooks. Concur in OpenAir. We run into this request more often than you may think because Concur is actually a pretty popular expense reporting tool. And once somebody starts using Concur, it becomes something that maybe the whole organization uses. So professional services may be the only ones using OpenAir, so they're not the exception. They have to also use Concur. When that happens, people will use Concur because it does provide more vendor focus information, ease of data entry, maybe a travel agency interface, that kind of stuff that allows early population of expenses for end users. So they'll want their end users to use Concur. They'll submit and have approvals done in Concur. But then you have to get that into a system for both payment of the expenses to the employee or corporate card, and also to rebill expenses if they're billable. And that's really where the integration to OpenAir comes in. So the integration to OpenAir will bring those expenses up into OpenAir as an expense report. And at that point, they tend to be imported as approved already. So if that integration is being considered, a lot of times I'll have the conversation with the customer to say, well, is the approval happening in Concur? Because if it is, let's leave the complete approval in Concur, and let's just bring in the approved stuff into OpenAir so that it can do the processing as far as rebilling to the customer as necessary, or for cost tracking in the customer. You can't actually import from Concur into an expense report as submitted and have it trigger the approval flow automatically in OpenAir. You would have to load it as an open expense report and then submit it. Somebody would have to go in and submit it for a secondary workflow within OpenAir, and not everyone wants to do that sort of two-system touch approach. Now, some of the tips related to Concur is the fact that Concur is an expense system, and it knows expenses by person, but Concur is not necessarily project smart, meaning that it doesn't have any understanding of projects. It's not structured to handle projects, so that tends to be a configuration or a customization to Concur to have a project understanding. That is, if you want Concur to pass approved expenses wholly into OpenAir and be project smart. So you have to end up having some kind of data flow, some kind of integration backwards into Concur so that you get a list of valid projects. And then once those projects are picked on the receipts, then of course that's how you can import it into OpenAir. If you don't want to do that project relationship or make Concur project smart, what ends up happening is you end up loading the expense item as an open expense report in OpenAir with no project relationship, and the person who owns that expense report has to come into OpenAir and associate it. So that person end up touching two systems. They touch Concur for the initial entry, and then they have to touch OpenAir to submit it and associate it to projects. So just keep that in mind when you're dealing with users and the time it will take for them to deal with two systems there. Okay. Interesting conversations I've had in the past with customers regarding Concur and OpenAir and where the data flow ends up coming into your accounting system for payables. So there's a couple of examples that you could always think about. One is if you're passing the expenses from Concur into OpenAir, can OpenAir just pass that over to your accounting system? So you just sort of have this one big swoop where Concur goes to OpenAir, OpenAir goes to accounting, and that's the data flow. So OpenAir is sort of the middleman in that flow, and that's a perfectly fine flow. It reuses, especially if you're dealing with OpenAir and NetSuite, it reuses the logic that is already understood between passing expense data, so it's a viable flow. But if not, if your organization as a whole is not completely in OpenAir, you tend to start leaving people out. So what you may consider is having Concur integration with your accounting system for payables, and have a Concur integration with OpenAir for rebilling only, and not have OpenAir pass anything over to your accounting system. So just you could think of those are both valid values or valid flows. It just depends on your organization structure and what's more usable. And then finally, NetSuite. So I could spend a whole couple of days probably talking about the NetSuite integration and all the different things that work well and things to watch out for and things to consider and options you have. But at a very high level, I consider this a native integration because there is so much that's been done on the OpenAir side to make it easy to do data mapping, to be able to do data translations by adding logic, to make it more user-friendly and easier for people versus having to be, sort of code savvy and know how to write things out of the box. So there has been a lot of enhancements in the past few releases to make this a very easy, very understandable integration configuration between OpenAir and NetSuite. And a lot of the systems now, when they're being provisioned upon purchase, you'll see that a lot of the standard NetSuite fields are also already available in OpenAir in anticipation that perhaps today or in the future you may want to build that integration. And so shortcut NetSuite's trying to help all of the customers wherever there's a standard integration field that's commonly used, like with Quickbooks or NetSuite, those are already available in the system. So it saves a lot of setup time there. Now the thing with the NetSuite and OpenAir integration is actually because NetSuite as a system has so many standard integrations, like there's a standard Concur to NetSuite integration. There's a possibility to integrate Salesforce and NetSuite together with some other third-party vendor solutions that are out there. NetSuite as a platform is pretty robust and has a lot of vendor integrations already available, which opens up a whole nother scope of things that you could integrate into OpenAir through NetSuite, like have it talk to NetSuite and then NetSuite passes it over to OpenAir because the OpenAir NetSuite integration is already there. So it really does benefit OpenAir to have this integration with NetSuite and potentially have NetSuite be the transfer point in some cases. Now here's just a high-level list of some of the things to think about when it comes to tips and controls for the NetSuite integration. Probably the first and foremost is what is the data flow? Because they can actually have OpenAir passing data to NetSuite or NetSuite passing data to OpenAir or both. So you have to sort of understand who's the master for what type of data and when is NetSuite the master, when is OpenAir the master. So we see the Salesforce OpenAir NetSuite flow quite often and Salesforce NetSuite OpenAir flow quite often. So it really comes down to when you're thinking about connecting the systems together, the very first thing you have to look at is which direction the data going does it make sense. Okay. Also, because NetSuite and OpenAir have a very robust integration potential, there are a lot of tables you can pass back and forth, a lot of objects. Besides just clients and projects, you can do expense items and services and users and all the charges and invoices and revenue and purchases and all that kind of stuff. And just because you can do everything doesn't mean you have to do everything. So what makes sense to pass from OpenAir and NetSuite? Where is the data most accurate? Where that accurate data can be passed to the other systems. So just think in terms of that. Just because you connect the systems doesn't mean you have to pass everything back and forth. Okay. And actually the latest upgrade to the UI has made it very easy to understand when you can, where and how to add logic to do data translation, but also the integration because you can add logic to the integration, can automate some of the things that end users would have had to type in. So instead of typing in the same value in 3 fields and then passing that across, having the integration be smart enough to say, oh, this value is in field A, I'm going to copy it to B, C, and D. Or I'm going to translate it and copy it to B, C, and D. So that's where I think the integration is not so much a field-to-field mapping, it's a field with expansion mapping, which is very useful. So in general, there's a lot of different ways to do integrations with OpenAir now. I would say probably about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a limited number of ways. The APIs were fairly new. The Integration Manager was around, so it was very limited. But now there's a lot of different ways, a lot of different vendors out there that are providing more flexibility to be able to have OpenAir talk to other systems, and it's more viable as a platform to talk to other systems. Before you jump into which is the right technology to go, make sure you do that whole ROI as far as how much time and effort are you saving from the end user to what's the benefit of the consistency and the cost of the technology to be able to make sure that there's a good return on investment. I'd probably say a good 90% of the time you will get a good ROI. It makes sense to do an integration. And then there's 10% of the time where the integration is a little too complicated or far-fetched and it's error-prone, and that actually may cause more work. So just think about things like that. And one of the things, sort of a selfish also plug for us, is I find that when you're working with integration consultants, there's integration understanding and then there's end system understanding. And you can't really dismiss the need to have someone understand the system that is being connected to. OpenAir is a very different system. It's got its own database, just like many systems have their own structure, their own processes, business processes, dependencies. So make sure if you're integrating, let's say OpenAir and Salesforce together, make sure you have someone that understands Salesforce as a platform and OpenAir as a platform while they're doing the integration. And that should make it have a smoother design and That way you'll have, avoid some of the pitfalls that could happen if you're working with someone who knows the integration really well, but they just don't know the end systems that they're talking about. Big lessons learned there from probably many of you that have gone through it, unfortunately, in the past.